companies and filers. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're happy to have a great set of speakers who have many decades of experience working with investment management filers and also with XBRL. So I'm just going to cover a few logistical points before we get started. If you have any kind of technical issues, please email us at support, SUPPORT, at xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. We are offering CPE credit for the session today. So if you requested to get CPE, or frankly, even if you hadn't, go ahead and make sure that you respond to the poll questions that will come up at 2 points during the session today. And as long as we have your recorded responses, we'll be able to get you that CPE credit certification. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host today. Today we have Joe Lechka. Joe is director at KPMG and is a long-standing member of XBRL US. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody to today's first of two-part series on investment management and XBRL. So what we'd like to do is to give you a brief overview, some opening remarks and introductions, and then we're going to turn it over to Scott Tice. So what I'd like to do is to just kind of give you an overview of today's session and also our second session on June 6th. Today, we'll be talking about a general overview of XBRL and how it works. Then Guy Stanzione from Compliance Service Directors from Top and Merrill will talk about identifying and tagging data in XBRL. And Mike Boyle, XBRL Manager at Donnelly Financial Solutions, will show you some examples and some demos of SEC sample reports and tips for your phase-in. During 2 parts of today's session, there will be a few CPE questions hosted by Michelle from XBRL US. Answering those questions will confirm your participation and enable you for the CPE credits. I do want to briefly mention that on June 6th, it'll be the second part of this investment management series and XBRL, where we'll talk about changes and considerations for your workflow and for implementation of the new rules. We're also going to talk a little bit on that session about the SEC staff interpretations, some FAQs, and other resources available to help you through this process.
Joe, I think somehow you're on mute.
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So there were some SEC releases, 33-10-771, that talked about reforms for registration, communication, and offering processes. There were certain exceptions in that rule for business development companies and for registered closed-end funds. Those exceptions are running out, and effective August 1st of 2022, business development companies and closed-end funds will be subject to these same rules. We're going to be going over some of those rules and disclosures that you're going to need to make, as well as the related XBRL tagging in this session. This alignment is going to include the use of XBRL tagging and certain XML tagging of certain fund fee information. Now, why are we tagging this in XBRL? Well, the SEC, about 12 years ago, started adopting XBRL as a means to electronically publish financial statement information. XBRL is helpful because structured data formats make financial information easier for investors to analyze and to help automate the regulatory filings. This structured financial information is a huge time saver for companies that are consuming the electronic data. Gone are the days of trying to pull the data out of PDFs and other electronic filings that were just basically static reports. With XBRL and the variety of tools that are available, that information will be available sooner and faster and more accurate through reduced key punch and reduced double entry. With that and why we are tagging XBRL, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Tice, who's going to give you an overview of XBRL and how it works. Take it away, Scott.
Thanks, Joe. My name is Scott Tice. I'm the chair of the Domain Steering Committee. And I realize a lot of people who are on here possibly don't know too much about XBRL. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes just giving a basic introduction So you're not kind of overwhelmed when we start actually talking about things like tagging and whatnot. So XBRL approached the problem here. And as Joe had mentioned, documents used to be primarily in paper form and very difficult to search. They had to be manually indexed. During the 1990s, we saw things like the Edgar system come up, and the Edgar system gave us things like text, PDF, and eventually HTML, much easier to disseminate, much quicker, but the search content was still not really reliably machine readable. And that's largely because you can't always differentiate between what a number is and how things are actually labeled. And it gets even more complicated with PDF and HTML. So clearly a method was needed to identify the data in a flexible and consistent manner. This is where XBRL, or Extensible Business Reporting Language, comes in. It's more than just a format. XBRL is a language that allows you to describe the particular data model. And it can vary from one industry to another, or even within a particular industry, depending on what's being filed and the intent of the data. And so XBRL then is employed by a lot of different organizations. Obviously, the SEC uses it for a number of areas, and more stuff is moving either to XBRL or into straight XML. The FDIC has been using it. They were one of the early US adopters. Recently, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has implemented XBRL. And there are many more, including some private NGO type operations like surety and insurance that exchange information in XBRL. In many cases, when we have marked up data, it's used by more than just regulators. It's used by educational institutions, individual investors, researchers, all kinds of people look at the data. Now let's look at what makes this all different. If we take us a table here, this actually ends up being out of a FERC filing, and look at our line items and our numbers, and these happen to be accounts. What's different about this is each one of these items in here actually has attributes associated with it in the background. What it actually means, what is the data type, and it's monetary. There's documentation behind it, including authoritative references as to why you have to disclose this. Who the entity actually is that is filing it, what period it is, what the units are. It could be Canadian, US, yen, etc. So it adds a lot of information in various ways to each data point within a document. So fundamentally, the building block of a taxonomy is a thing called a concept, also sometimes known as an element. You'll hear that term, which comes from XML. The taxonomy essentially defines a set of concepts, their characteristics, and their relationships with other concepts. Concepts can represent simple things like cash. They can also represent more complex things like dimensional data, such as East Coast or US sales or things like that. Each concept then has properties associated with it, like the data type, such as it's a monetary item, or it's a percentage, or it's a measurement of energy. The period type, is it for the period that's ended, or is it for a duration? The balance type, and there are other things as well. Concepts also have related documentation and authoritative references, and this is one of the things that really helps XBRL stand out in the long run. So if we think about the structure, I'm not doing this as a tree because this is a little more how you'd see it in Yeti. I have a top or entry point. I have various tables. You might think of this as being document and entity information or balance sheet information. I'll have line items. Abstracts is the term that we use for headings within the line items, where they group other concepts under that. So you can have very simple entry points and tables, or very complicated ones, depending on the particular application. And if I look in Yeti or other programs, I'll see these types of setups within the data for the taxonomy. So again, assets, abstract, current. And what I see here is more abstracts. Under this particular abstract, I have then some actual concepts. So if I look at data filed today, in this case, it's an 8K. This is going to be a little similar to what you'd see with CEF, because CEF on its own is pretty much marking up some fairly simple data within the forms. There's more complexity. We'll get into that. If I look at this HTML document in a browser, I don't see much of anything different than I'd normally see. But if I go to the SEC's viewer, because it has inline XBRL, I'll see these red highlighted items. And that indicates information that is tagged. So let's look closer at that. So if I just pick one item out of the table here, such as the exchange, I'll see in this first box the attributes of the fact, what the concept name is, what is the fact date, it's NASDAQ, and what is the period that it's associated with. This actually just ends up being from one date to the same date. What type of data is it, etc. And then I'll see some of the taxonomy information, such as what is this actually defined as a label? How is it going to be used? This has only two different types of labels. And finally, what are the references? In other words, what authority is this really under? So quickly running through this, then we have the concept we talked about defined by the taxonomy. Then we have the facts or the data that's part of what's known as the instance. That is actually what is submitted to the regulatory agency. Contexts are associated with concepts to identify facts. And the context would be 12/31, 2021. I can have dimensional aspects to that, and they can actually end up being very complicated depending on the data being represented. When we get into mutual fund stuff, there's a lot of dimensionalization when it comes to series and class information. So the instance then is that collection of information that represents the XBRL disclosure of your data, that contains the context that define the period and also the dimensional information, and it also contains data items or facts that are those intersections. So if we look at an inline item here, and this is actually off of one of the SEC examples for a 485B pause, I can pick a particular item that's highlighted in yellow, and I see then the attributes that are associated with that. So within the HTML, this is marked as this name, and this is using the guidelines the SEC prescribes for the context names as of for an instant, as opposed to some other name. And then the concept. And I'm seeing the concept name, annual dividend payment current. And this little CEF in front here is what's known as a qualifier, a prefix. And that just simply says this belongs to the CEF taxonomy. Taxonomies can be simple or complex. CEF is simple, risk return is pretty simple. Taxonomies can be really complex. US GAAP, as an example, has over close to 20,000 concepts. IFRS has, I think, around 7,000. Take that with risk return and CEF. Risk return, I think, has about 400. Some taxonomies are open, meaning that you, as a preparer, or just disclose, you can add elements to it. CEF is not open; it's closed. GAAP is open. So key takeaways then: taxonomy defines a uniform data model. The SEC employs a lot of different taxonomies. Some of them are things like the document and entity information, or DEI, you'll hear that term, has things like your CIK, your actual company name is registered, what your public float is, like in a 10K or things like that. Then there's the SEC reporting taxonomy that has more items that are specific to the SEC. Those are then mixed together. So you can have more than one taxonomy that's being used as part of your filing. Some taxonomies are managed by the SEC. Some are managed by NGOs like FASB, XBRL International, or IASB, etc. The instance is a collection of the data of what you actually file. It consists of facts and context. There's a lot more to GAAP. For CEF, you're only filing the instance. And I believe this schema. And then the instant data is embedded in HTML, and that's known as inline XBRL or iXBRL. In some cases, you have just plain XML XBRL, where it's just the data. There's no document stuff. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle, and we're going to go ahead and move to the first set of CPE questions. Michelle?
Scott, thanks very much. Okay, I guess I will go and share my screen now. Let's see. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and bring up our poll questions. And okay, here's our first poll question. And remember to respond to this question if you are interested in getting CPE credit. So the first question, Which of the following US regulators requires reporting entities to submit data in XBRL format? Is it the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Department of Labor? Okay, we'll take about another 30 seconds or so on this question. Okay, just like another 15 seconds. All right, and we're going to be closing down this poll now. And as I bring up the other poll, I wanted to mention to everyone that if you do have questions that you'd like to send in to any of our speakers, please just use the Q&A button that you see on the screen, and you'll be able to submit your question directly. Okay, our next poll question. Which of the following is defined in an XBRL taxonomy? Is it time periods? Is it concepts? Or is it facts or values? Which is defined in a taxonomy? All right, about another 30 seconds here. Okay, we're going to be shutting the poll down in just a few seconds, so please make sure you get your answer in. All right, I'll go ahead and close down that poll. And now I'm going to turn it over, back over to Joe, who's going to take us to the our next speaker. And again, I just want to mention, please be sure to submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A link and posting your questions there. So back to you, Joe.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So to build on what Scott was explaining with regards to XBRL, the BDCs and the closed-end funds are going to be submitting an inline XBRL, which is one document that contains both the data, which are the numbers and the disclosures and the reports included in your filings, and also the XBRL metadata. And that's the information that Scott was pointing out, such as concepts, elements, and facts and time periods that describe the data. And what they're going to do is they're going to describe the data so that software programs can understand what is being disclosed, whether it's a dollar or a count or a name of the particular investment that's disclosed in your report. Moving on, we're going to move to Guy Stanzione, who's SEC Compliance Services Director at Top & Merrill, who's going to talk to you about the data in your filings and which data points are going to need to be tagged and how they will be tagged. Take it away, Guy.
Thanks, Joe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build on what Scott had said. And when I turn it over to Mike, you're going to see in visual presentation some of the concepts that I'm talking about on the next few slides. So when you look at closed ends, as Scott had mentioned, it's a very, very different animal than GAAP, more similar to risk return, but with more complexity. And when you think about what adds to the complexity, it's first time. So mutual fund filers on Form N1A have been tagging since 2011. They were introduced to inline XBRL years later, so there was some sense of familiarity about XBRL and what it meant to that group of filers. Well, closed-end filers and BDCs are being exposed to XBRL for the first time and being introduced directly into inline XBRL. So where the open-end filers had that gap, they got to experience the 15 business day waiting period or grace period between the event and when the XBRL had to file. Closed-end filers and BDCs do not get that same opportunity. Taking it one step further, BDCs will also, we'll jokingly call it get the double whammy, because not only will they have to file the registration statements on Form N2 in inline XBRL, they'll also have to begin tagging their Forms 10Ks and 10Qs using inline XBRL, using the GAP taxonomy. So what we're seeing here is a crossover, unlike anything that we've experienced in the 40 Act world, where risk return was a registration statement. There was a very distinct section within the prospectus called the risk return summary that had to be tagged. Very clean cut, items 2, 3, and 4, and that's all it was. As we transition into the world of closed-end filers, moving into XBRL, we're going to talk a little bit about it, maybe not so much in the slides, but in talking points. We're seeing some crossover. We're seeing the concepts of incorporation by reference to content that's already on Edgar, using streamlined filing techniques. So you're incorporating by reference, but that adds a level of complexity potentially, because that content that's incorporated by reference, if it's in one of the items that needs to be tagged, must be tagged in the corresponding document that's being referenced. So in the case of an N2, for a closed-end filer, it potentially would be the NCSR filing, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we get into the items. For a BDC or a business development company, it's the content within the 10Q and 10K. So there's a level of complexity here that we haven't experienced in the 40 Act world and in the 33-34 Act world as well. So when you look at the timelines, you're looking at the beginning of inline XBRL starting in August of 2022 for the N2s. And it's not all N2s within an event. It's only the last N2 in which a filer is declared effective. And you have to excuse me, folks. My granddaughter was nice enough to share a cold with me over the last couple of days. But for a BDC, they will have to file their N2 and any 10K or 10Q for a period ending after August 1st, if they fall under A2 qualified or WIXI, as you're seeing on the screen. So the larger filers begin inline filing this year. The smaller BDCs, will begin next February. So they get a little bit of a grace period. The same thing applies to closed-end filers, the same compliance dates. The larger filers this year, the smaller filers beginning in February of next year. But what the SEC did not do here, that we talked a little bit about on the open-end side, is they didn't consolidate the content to be tagged. The items which fall under a mutual fund prospectus, which are right in the very front of the prospectus, does not apply necessarily here when you look at the various items that need to be tagged for an N2. So when you're looking at cover page tagging, which does now exist in the open-end world, where the DEI is derived from a lot of the information that's on the cover, the filer type, the effective date, things like that, the prospectus date, the effective date, I should say. You're also finding items that are scattered throughout the prospectus related to the content that needs to be tagged. So fees and expenses, which falls into item 3.1, all the way down to outstanding securities, which is item 10.5. When you look at content such as risk factors or investment objectives and policies, that is content that is potentially utilized and contained in the content within an NCSR, which is the annual report filing for a fund company, or theoretically the 10K. So for a B2C annual refiling, when you look at this content, it's never had to be tagged before. XBRL does not exist on the 40X side for shareholder reports, only prospectuses. But now there's the introduction of, let's provide the opportunity to streamline the content in the N2 filing. But if you're going to do that and you're going to incorporate certain content by reference on a go-forward basis, that content will need to be tagged in the shareholder report. The good news, if we want to call it good news, is the SEC did come back to us and answer one of our questions related to looking backwards prior to the compliance date. So for instance, a closed-end fund that has a 12/31 fiscal year end that would file its annual report at the end of February or early March, if it's prior to the 2022 compliance date, that content would not have to be tagged. So you would not have to do a refiling of that document. But when you look at the BDC side, it's a little more complicated, because now what you're looking at is a 10K that is using the GAAP taxonomy for the financials, potentially also using the closed-end taxonomy for that content that's incorporated by reference in these items that you see on the screen. So using an example of a closed-end fund, you're seeing risk factors on the left-hand side that is incorporated by reference to the content that was in the NCSR filing. So theoretically, in the past, the annual report that filed on NCSR would file as HTML, and you would not see anything related to XBRL. Now, potentially moving forward, if the filer who files the N2 wants to incorporate that content by reference, they would then have to tag the risk factors following the closed-end taxonomy. The same holds true for BDC, who's incorporating reference by content by reference to a 10K. So these are the elements that we talked about that added considerable complexity to the conversation, as well as some of the other ideas that the SEC put forth that we have been trying to see clarification for our filers, that we have been able to get a lot of answers. We're not going to spend all the time today talking about it, but certainly this group is here and available for any follow-up questions that you might have. So speaking about a financial table that the corporate filers have been using for years, that the BDC filers will now be exposed to, is the concept of detail tagging. So you're looking at a footnote or a note within the financial statements, and what you're seeing here is the new element that is level 1 tagging. So that's the block tag of the entire note. Level 2 is a block tag of content within that entire note, in this case, significant accounting policies. Level 3 tagging is a block tag of the table within the entire block. And let's add some more fun to it, level 4 tagging, which is tagging each value within the table. So open-end filers have had the pleasure of dealing with a very simple taxonomy, as Scott mentioned earlier, way fewer elements than you're looking at in GAAP, which is on the high side of 20,000 at this point, as Scott said. This brings a level of complexity, a level of detail that 40 Act filers have never had to experience and will be for the first time.
Great, thank
Back
you,
to you,
Guy.
Joe.
Oh, thank you, Guy. And moving on, now that we've got an understanding of some of the data facts that will be tagged here and the levels of tagging, we're going to move on and we're going to talk to Mike Boyle from Donnelly, and he's going to give you some tips and some guidance into how to get to successfully implementing this. Mike?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Guy. Really very informative, a lot of good information there. And what I'm going to try and do is add to that. So I'm going to take about 2 minutes to go through my part of the presentation, which is really only a guide to what we are going to look at live. So the SEC has provided samples for the CEF, so we're going to take a look at what's been provided, where to find them, how to use them, and some key takeaways. Through the course of doing that, we'll discuss why the samples are provided the way they are, which is kind of in parts and pieces and not as one complete N2. We will review what dimensions need to be created. We'll discuss some new data types which are not applicable in risk return. And I should add, I'm going to reference risk return a number of times. So for you folks who are familiar with that, it might be beneficial. But for you folks who are not, it's not something to worry about. This is all new information. And I would say for you, you know, it's less that you have to unlearn. So it's not a problem if you're not familiar with risk return. One thing that does not exist in risk return documents are multiple calendar periods. All the facts are as of the date of the prospectus. That's different in CEF. We'll take a look at that. And then lastly, we'll take a look at something that we don't know yet. I think as Guy and Joe have referenced, we've gotten a lot of information from the SEC, but not everything we've asked. So there is definitely more information to come from them. They've indicated that. They didn't necessarily indicate when, but we know we're going to get more information. So as part of the presentation, there are 3 links here, 3 things you're going to want to have at your fingertips as you're going through and learning this. There's the taxonomy guide.
Mike, you're not sharing your screen right now?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Hold on, Michelle. Let me correct that. There we go. Better?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. So what I was saying, folks, 3 links here. You have a link to the CEF taxonomy guide, a link to the taxonomy and the samples, and then finally a link to the SEC's into instructions. And as you go through educating yourself on this or working with your vendors, you're really going to want to have all 3 of these at the ready. So what we're going to do is start with the taxonomy and the samples. And you want to click on CEF 2021 Q4 and then scroll down a little bit. It doesn't take you right there. And the key items from this page will be this, which are your samples, and this, the taxonomy guide, which I just mentioned. So as far as the samples go, when you download and unzip that, here is what you're going to see. You will see all of these folders as well as this README file. I highly suggest you read the README file. It's only a page and a half or 2 pages, and it does a very good job of explaining what's contained in the samples. So what we're going to look at today are the core components and the things that are required to be tagged in CEF. And Guy mentioned some of these. So if we start, let's pick one here. Let's go find risk factors, which is right here. And again, these are SEC samples. Now, one thing you will notice in the risk factors section is it begins right here. And your entire risk content is tagged with this risk factors table text block. And if we expand this attribute dialog box, you can see that. Everything is here. Now, Guy was mentioning how we are now, or Guy and Scott, how we are now doing detail tagging. Now, we're doing this in risk return as well, but what's different is for each specific risk, you are going to have to create a custom member to identify that risk. So if we go down and we start scrolling through, you see here's the limited term risk. Here's investment and market risk, income risk, and you can see in each case, the user had to create a custom member. Now, that is not the case in risk return. that comes with those members, such as for risk lose money, FDIC insured, and things like that. But for now, at least for year one, it does not. And you can see here in your XBRL viewer, when you look at your members, you can see these have all been custom created. Now, some of these risk sections, as many of you well know, can go for 10, 20, 30 pages. So you're going to have quite a few risks to account for. Okay. So that's one section. Let's take a look at another one, which is share price data. Now, this illustrates another difference between risk return and CEF. As you can see, this table here, there are a number of periods which need to be accounted for. Let me just get this out of the way here. Whoops. So if we take this 909, for example, 3 months ended March 31st, 2020. 1055, 3 months ended 6/30, 2019. So you see over on the left-hand side on your stub, all of these calendar periods now need to be accounted for. And this too is different than risk return, okay? It's not a huge deal, but it's more work, there's some additional complexity, and it is something to be aware of. Now, if we go back to the README file for a moment, as Guy was showing, these are all your items which need to be tagged. Some of them have sub-items, such as B and D here, B, C, and E below. What you also see in here is a little bit of what we just discussed, what members need to be created for the various risks. And then down below, there are 6 other files. And what these are kind of for exceptions. They're saying that for these document types, you may encounter some content which requires a tag from the CEF taxonomy. So if we were to go look at this 8K, for example, you'll see, there we go. So that's a DEI item, right? This is also a DEI item. When we get down into short-term debt, that's a US GAAP item. But the next item, effects of leverage, is from the CEF taxonomy. So there will be some documents which require both GAAP and CEF taxonomy. So that's what the SEC attempted to provide here. A couple of small examples, and they are small. As you can see here, here's another one. Starts with a DEI item. Another DEI item, followed by effects of leverage again, which is a CEF item. Okay. Let's take a look at something we're still waiting for clarification on. Supplements will be 424s. Now that might be a full supplement. It might be a sticker. If it's a sticker, the expectation is it's going to be handled very much like a risk return sticker, making use of the supplement to prospectus text block, which I have highlighted right here. So this is your entire taxonomy. Now, this is the exact same tag which is in the risk return taxonomy. And for risk return, it's very clear how this is to be used. For minimal tagging, we will only use this. For encouraged tagging, we would use this plus whatever detail tags are applicable. Now, as far as CEF goes, the SEC has included the tag in the taxonomy, but they have not provided any guidance or any samples on how to proceed. So we do not yet know if 497 minimal, or pardon me, if minimal and encouraged tagging will continue to exist the way we know them from risk return, or if there's going to be some separate instruction. But we do know it's in the taxonomy. So there will be some supplement / sticker tagging. In terms of how these samples were provided, when these first came out and we saw, wow, there's 10 and there's 16 separate sets of data to use for examples. Well, it seemed kind of cumbersome and unnecessary, and we weren't quite sure why they did it that way. And to be honest with you, we're still not sure why they did it that way, but a couple of possibilities. One being that when you start looking at N2s, N2As, any of their children form types, you are not necessarily going to have all of this content in any one document. You might have all of it, but there might not be, other securities. There might not be long-term debt. So it could have been that the SEC was unable to come up with a really comprehensive N2 to provide for tagging. So what they did was they provided all of these separate files showing the specific tagging which needs to be done. And now that we've had our hands on these for a while, I actually think it is more useful to do that, because if you're going through a document, you're trying to determine what tags are applicable to your data, you can go into one such as this here, which is the investment objective and policy sample, go in, take a look, say, okay, got it. That's the tag we need here. And they've provided quite a bit of narrative here. So that's good. This is a pretty good example. They have provided pretty good examples in really just about all of these. This is the long-term debt sample. There's not much here. But then again, I've seen quite a few N2s or N2As where this is all there is. So this is what you would tag in the case of long-term debt. So what you want to do is you want to go to the SEC, you want to download this, unzip them, upload them. You can use a rel, whatever vendor you're working with probably has a viewing tool which you could make use of, and kind of start to poke through these and get familiar with them. The other good thing is, being that they're all separate, you don't have to navigate through a list of facts, which is hundreds of facts long, right? So this one here, again, we're in the risk section. So this only has 62 facts, okay? As you can see, many of them are in the DEI or on the cover. Oh, and the other thing I want to mention about the covers to keep in mind, when you're looking at the cover and you start clicking on tags, DEI, right? As usual, a lot of DEI tags on the cover. However, what you're also going to see now are DEF tags on the cover. And this also speaks to some of the new data types. So for this one, new data type, Boolean. Now it's not technically a new data type because it is used in risk return for amendment flag. I believe, but that's it. In CEF, it has much broader usage. Whenever you have all of these items at the bottom of your cover page, it'll be in use. Now, you may have, you may submit your work with only these two, the two boxes you actually checked, right? Which would be fine. But in this case, in the sample, which is good, it has everything. So if you keep your eye on this attribute dialog box, is this a closed-end fund? True. BDC, false. Interval fund, false. A2 qualified, false. WIXI, false. Emerging growth company, false. And then we get back to new registrant, true. So, pardon me. Much broader usage. I think one of the other new data types are shares, which there are not in risk return. So that's how the samples have been put together. I think they're, the more time I've spent with them, the more useful they are. There are some flaws. When you look at the capital stock sample, there's no there. All it is a cover. And even when you look at the fact panel, there are no tags for the capital stock. So that's a problem. But again, what you'll want to do is make sure you have handy your taxonomy guide, as well as your SEC N2 instruction document from the SEC. So, depending where you are in the pipeline of these documents, if you're a lawyer, you're going to be a little more familiar with this, right? If you're a technical person, you'll be a little more familiar with the taxonomy and the taxonomy guide. So again, recommend that you have this, Form N2, the samples, all of it available. And between them, the answer to your questions, plus with the help of your vendors, you'll be able to get through it. So Michelle, I think I'm turning it back to you now. Is that correct, or Joe?
Mike, thanks very much. But I think we're going back to Joe.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to all of our speakers today, Scott, Guy, and Mike, who have been a wealth of knowledge today. One of the things that I wanted to just take a look at is to see if we had any questions in the chat here, and we can actually see if there's anything here. I do see one, however, I think it was kind of cut off a little bit. Just 1 second while I open this one up. Okay, I'm not actually able to see that question. Michelle, I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, there are questions in the Q&A. Are you able to see those?
Oh, sorry, I was in the chat. Okay. All right, there we go. So one of the questions I have, and I guess this is, let's give this one to Guy. Will the NCSR need tagging?
The answer is yes and no. If you're going to incorporate by reference and you streamline content in your N2, then, and it's content in one of the items that both Mike and I showed, then the answer is yes. But if you plan to put all the content in the N2, are not using an incorporation by reference model, then the NCSR would not need to be tagged.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is up for Mike. On what basis are they selecting periods for the N2 cover page tags?
Yep, thanks, Joe. Let me share again.
You're currently sharing, Mike.
Okay. All right. So if we take this table, for example, which is in the share price data sample, and then just quickly to reference back to the README, right? Share price. So here's the file. And by the way, you can see how the files were named. Share price, and then the applicable item, 8.5, and then the sub-items, B, C, and E. But anyhow, back to the question. So if we were to take one of these values, such as 518 here, well, where is that? It's under the fiscal year ending 12/31/2020, and specifically, it is fourth quarter. So if we click on that, we will see 3 months ending 12/31/2020. So you are going to use your content as your guide as to what the applicable period is. Okay, if we look at another one, we go to the last one in, well, let's do the next row, 1089. So that's under fiscal year ended 12/31/2019, first quarter, right? And that's what you see the period as, 3 months ended 3/31/2019.
All right, great.
Just a reminder that if you didn't see in the chat are the links to the documents from the SEC. They'll also be on XBRL US's website, I'm sure.
Okay, great. Thank you for the link, Scott. We've got 3 more questions. The next one goes back to Mike, and that is, does the schedule of investments require detailed tagging, or is it possible to do summary tagging similar to real estate investment trusts?
I'll start that and I'll let anybody else pick up.
Okay.
No, Mike, go ahead.
No, Guy, I was just about to hand it off to you, so go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. Well, that's a great question, and it is a question that we have out to the SEC. If you were to, as you are asking today, the answer would be it's going to require detailed tagging, which we also realize it's going to create a lot of facts that need to be tagged. We did present a question to the SEC based on the fact that summary tagging has been allowed in REITs, but right now, as of today, it is detailed tagging.
All right, great, thank you. I'll pitch this next one to you as well. For BDC companies, 10K filings, we need to tag prospectus information also with the risk factors like share price data. Do we tag the annual operating expense table as well?
I'm going to hand this one off to, because I'm stronger on the 40X side. So I'm going to ask somebody who has more strength than I do on the 34X side, if they don't mind. Maybe Scott?
Call CorpFin. By the way, prodding the SEC on some of these things is a good idea, so we can get more clarification on them.
Yes, thank you.
All right, last one. This was in follow-up to your question, Guy, from before from the NCSR. For the NCSR, do we need to tag the financials or only the risk factors?
The easy way to answer that is anything that's incorporated by reference. So there's also investment objectives that you would find in the NCSR that would have to be tagged as well. Any of those items that Mike and I showed on the screen, if they're not going to be included in detail in the N2, would need to be incorporated by reference. Yeah, so you'd have to tag anything in the NCSR. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, Guy. One thing I would add to Guy's answer is, yes, we're talking about a lot of form types now with CEF, right? But think in terms of items, right? If the item exists in the document and it's not incorporated by reference, it has to be tagged. I think thinking of it that way more so than, well, okay, I'm in an NCSR or I'm in a PAS AMI or I'm in an N2A. just focus on the item, right? Does item, does item 3.1 exist? Well, if you have a fee table, which is what item 3.1 is, then yes, you have to tag it. So think items.
All right, well, thank you very much. I will say thank you to all of our presenters, to Scott, to Guy, to Mike. Thank you to Michelle and David from XBRL US for hosting this today. As mentioned before, this is part one of a two-part series. Series 2 is going to be coming up in June 6th. I will give you a couple pieces of advice. One is it's complicated, start early, educate yourselves to the requirements and the taxonomies, communicate with your vendors and potentially your peers to make sure you're well prepared when the deadline comes and you need to start tagging your files in XBRL. With that, I'll thank you all and I'll turn it back to Michelle Savage and I'll let her finish up for today.
Great, thanks very much, Joe. And thanks to all of our speakers. We did a great job. What we're going to do right now is take some additional CPE questions. For those of you getting CPE credit, make sure to watch your screen. Okay, so here is the first question. Which of the following is not a requirement of the new SEC rules? Is it response 1, closed-end funds and BDCs must include inline XBRL and N2 registration statement cover pages? Is it response number 2, BDCs must submit financial statement information in inline XBRL? Or number 3, BDCs must submit financial statement information in traditional XBRL as opposed to inline XBRL? Okay, so let's take another 20 seconds on this one. Okay, I'm going to be closing down this poll now. So thank you all for submitting your responses. All right, and we will go to our last poll. What is the first compliance date for affected funds eligible to file a short form registration statement? Is it answer number 1, August 1st, 2022, answer 2, August 1st, 2023, or answer 3, November 1st, 2022? Which is the correct response? We'll take about another 30 seconds. Okay, just like another 10 seconds here. And we're going to close that down. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to mention is just, Joe had mentioned this early on. This is part 1 of a 2-part session. So please join us on June 7th for mastering new SEC XBRL requirements for investment management companies. It's going to be, we have a lot more to cover. This is the URL to register if you haven't received it already, and we'll be sending it to everybody again as well. We're going to be having some different speakers on that session. And as I think Guy had mentioned, we will be receiving some more responses from the SEC to questions that we posed to them related to this rule implementation, and we'll be sharing that with everybody on that call as well. So thanks again, and we'll see you in early June.